Here we are again. I'm late. I'm always perpetually late. I said 8:30. I'm 23 minutes late. But listen, I was Jaguar momming it, okay? That's a thing. Y'all, what the hell is a Jaguar mom? Well, if you ever heard of Tiger Mom, right? There's a whole book written, this woman, how she's a Tiger Mom, and it's generally applied to very ambitious and diligent, authoritative Chinese mothers, and how they essentially drive this drive their children towards success. Well, I like to say I'm a Jaguar mom. I'm like a black version of the Tiger Mom, but probably, not quite as, stereotypically like driven, sort of in the periphery, like don't have any peripheral vision, very narrow idea of what success is. But I do drive my children to be their best selves. I talk very openly with my older daughters around being a mom at percent, but it's more of like, I got wrapped up in this relationship with this person who I was not totally sure I wanted to be in a relationship with, and then had my two children while still working through college and all that kind of stuff. And I want for them to know that they have options, that moms like me and women like me are out here grinding and hustling so that our daughters and the daughters of other women, our colleagues and friends and nieces, have other opportunities. That this idea of black woman equals struggle, or black womanhood equals struggle, the struggle life is not necessarily the truth. I mean, everyone struggles, period. I don't care what, life is struggle, right? But this idea of it being like perpetual struggle, and that always being equated with the black woman's experience, that we struggle from the day that we're born until the day that we die, and that the only thing worthy of us ever talking about is struggle. I don't want them to think that has to be the reality for them. I want them to know that they can look at my struggles and learn from my struggles, and that sometimes learning from mistakes means that you get to learn from other people's mistakes so you don't have to make them. So, yeah, I'll be in here Jaguar momming it. So I was like, everything in my house, we run, like, I tell my kids we got deadlines. We on a timeline, right? So your chores need to be done by this time, because then I need to make dinner, and then you need to do this, and then we need to do that. So I had a bunch of kids sitting at our very small kitchen table here, using our chalkboard wall to get their homework done. They were helping each other. When the little ones had questions, the big ones just kind of jumped in. They came to me, they needed help. I'm trying to get my pork loin together, because tonight I am making a stuffed pork loin. And things of that nature. So I was late. I say all that to say I was late. My bad. If you look at the title for this, there is I was featured in a website called esme.com, which stands for empowering solo mothers everywhere. And the beautiful Tanisha Christie, very smart, multidisciplinarian performer, um, interviewed me myself. But what I do like about it thus far is that, one, it approaches this idea of solo motherhood. You notice that they don't use single motherhood. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that term and why I have a strong dislike, basically like a hate for that term, um, very intentionally. And I like that their lens is really leaning towards being intersectional. So understanding that solo motherhood comes in many, many different variations. Some of us choose to be solo mothers. Some of us end up being solo mothers and we didn't expect it. Some of us are solo mothers over the age of 60 because we've become caregivers for children of our relatives. That solo motherhood looks many, many different ways, and that there are many ways in which we can approach empowering solo mothers and essentially decreasing the stigma, or as I like to say, destigmatizing this idea of solo motherhood. And it would, there's a couple. It's a short read. It's really concise, and I really like it. But there were themes in here that, as I was reading it afterwards, I was like, "Yes, bitch, you answered that question." But I wanted to go a little bit more in depth about it. And when you're doing pieces for websites, they have to be concise. There was so much more of this conversation that Tanisha and I had, and I know that she probably had like a word count that she needed to adhere to, but there were things with y'all that I wanted to dig a little bit deeper about around this. And really what this is about, because they featured my nonprofit, the Black Project, but really what it was about, it was about featuring the nonprofit, the Black Project. But what it was about was me as a solo mother doing this work, and what is it about my solo motherhood experience that drives me to do this work, right? And my work is informed by my mothering experience, particularly my mothering experience as a Black woman, as a formerly marginalized, because I don't feel like I guess in the grand scheme of things, I'm marginalized, but as I move through the world, I don't see my place in a place of marginalization. Taylor, we can talk about that in a little bit. Don't be knee-jerk. Don't do anything yet. There's a conversation that we need to have first. So you can do other things. Can you do me a favor and go grab your brother first? The Black Project, for those who don't know, who aren't acquainted, in 2009, I founded and I currently run the Black Project, which is spelled BLKPROJEK. And I had a former follower, because I blocked her punk ass, who made fun of the name. She's like, "Oh my God, Black Project, what a mess. I'm so done." Bitch, whatever. Anyways, that's the name of it. It really is a throwback and sort of paying homage to this idea of being in urban spaces, me growing up as an 80s and 90s baby, and being very much cultured in the hip hop. I mean, hip hop as a culture, the B-boys and the B-girls and the DJs and the battles and the graffiti culture of that time. So that's why it's spelled that way, if anyone wants to know. But the mission is about empowering Black women and their children through the local and good food movement. And people ask me, how is it that I consider the Black Project a Black feminist or Black empowerment? And I stay away from that term, Black women's empowerment, because it has some different connotations that I don't necessarily agree with. But if we want to look at it just in terms of taking the term for what it sounds like, it really is about me uplifting Black women and their children. And they say, well, how does food justice do that? And so that was sort of one of the questions that Tanisha had asked me in this. And my answer was like, food justice is the mechanism in which to talk about and explore the root of these issues, right? Because I really do believe food inaccessibility, food racism, food injustice, however you want to look at it, that's a symptom, right? It's a function of a larger disease, right? And so and when you really look at it on a deeper level, when we think about when people turn to their basest instincts when their back is against the wall, right? Look at the basic needs of people, right? Hunger is the first one. You can't do anything until you feel nourished. You can't. And so if you look at okay, so this sounds funny, right? Like the zombie apocalypse, for anybody who watches The Walking Dead, or if you watch Z Nation, or if you watch any of those dystopian future type things, when do people really start acting crazy? When do people roll up on their neighbors that they knew for 20 years, put the gun up in their mouth, run up in their place and take all of their supplies, right? And all their rations? Or when do people decide they're going to band together and go out there and do what they need to do, and possibly then as a community run down the next group of people to get what they need? When they start feeling hungry. When people are hungry, that's when you see the makeup of their character, what they're really going to do in order to be able to feed themselves. And so in a more broad sense, in many of our communities that are feeling disconnected, in many of our communities that are feeling like their backs are against the wall, this idea of how am I going to keep my children? How am I going to keep myself? How am I going to keep my family? And in my case, how am I going to keep my community from being hungry? Really is the basis of how do we continue to make sure that we have communities that can thrive. To me, that is the basis of civilization. When people are nourished, when they are whole, when they have their basic needs met, when they have food that is easily accessible, culturally relevant, and is not going to kill them, when they have education that is holistic, when they have quality housing, right, that meets their needs and the needs of their family, when they have access to land, when they have a healthy environment, and I mean that holistically. I'm talking about clean water, access to arable soil, all that kind of stuff. Then we see people thriving. So for me, the entry point to this conversation, the basis by which we will get down to the real nitty gritty of how we are going to empower women and their children. Because if you are not having a conversation about the fact that about the fact that poverty is feminine, then you're not having a conversation, right? And the fact that when you're talking about hunger, those who are the most affected by hunger are children. Like, sorry. We see the face of the mother, right? The adult mother who is going to apply for them. But it really is the children who are the main beneficiaries. And by leaps and bounds, it is children who are. And so one of the other things that we really got into was when Tanisha asked me, are you, she says to me, and you're persevering. And it seems to me that making the choice to have children is an act of liberation. And this is something that I've wanted to have a deeper conversation with Black mothers about, particularly Black mothers who proclaim to be Black feminist. A friend of mine, Una, the other day put up a meme that I know she was intentionally being provocative, and I know her on a personal level. She's one of my oldest friends, so I probably have an idea around how she felt about the meme, but she was putting it up to be provocative. I know, Una, you being provocative. But she put up this meme that says, was the introduction to feminism dividing the Black family or cause division in the Black family? And I kind of did like a hard eye roll because I knew exactly where that was going. I was like, child, let me get my tea, sip this tea, and just watch the craziness unfold on the thread. And it did. And I didn't have the willingness or the emotional capacity to even address half of what I felt was nonsense that a lot of people, male and female, women and men, were spewing on that thread. What I need to say is that feminism existed in Black communities before it was called feminism. That's number one. Fuck all that shit about, the language definitely, I think, has been co-opted by white feminism. We think of feminism and we think of white women leading the feminist movement, but we had feminism. Many West African communities were very much centered in the matriarch. You did not make decisions in communities unless you consulted the elder women. Yes, many of them also had some very defined gender roles, but many of these communities were centered in sort of the divine feminine energy. Okay, that's a thing. Fela Kuti's mother, Fela Kuti, right? The very popular late Fela Kuti, who really helped put Afrobeat on the map, mainstream, from Nigeria. His mother was a very reputed feminist. Maybe the language didn't call her a feminist, but when you look at the actual ideology of what she was talking about, she was a feminist. Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman were feminists, okay? So Black feminism did not divide the Black community, okay? There's a lot of things that divided the Black community. It was not Black feminism. Black feminism has saved much of the Black community. Whatever there was to salvage, Black feminism saved that. Okay? So let's make sure that we so I know that using that term has been off-putting for a lot of people who associate feminism with white women, and they see how white feminism has absolutely failed Black women and Black families. And I think for me, the biggest source of contention of mainstream parentheses white feminism has been that much of it has been steeped in this idea of reproductive rights, which is very different than reproductive justice. And if you're looking at that article now, I don't know if the correction has been made. It said reproductive justice, and that is a typo. It should say reproductive rights, but reproductive rights from a feminist perspective has not been good to Black women. Okay, much of it, and many Black feminists who have really written some very smart things about reproductive justice. Again, there's a difference between reproductive justice and reproductive rights, and you should look that up. Google is an amazing place, so I would encourage you to start looking up the differences between them, because reproductive justice was really created with non-white, and I hate using that term, non-white women in mind, right? Immigrant women and Black women. Black women have been at the forefront of the reproductive justice movement. And one of the things that the reproductive justice movement has talked about is that a lot of reproductive rights seems to be steeped in me to ever say anything bad about that, right? I'm not going to argue with how, important it is for Black women and any woman to have access to abortion, to terminate a pregnancy if they need to. And I'm never going to argue with the ability for Black women and girls to have access to reproductive health, right? And their ability to get, to get balanced, easily accessible family planning and birth control mechanisms and devices. I'm not arguing that. What I am saying, however, is that a lot of this accessibility to birth control and to termination, abortion, in many ways has left out and deliberately excluded, and in some cases, particularly in early feminist, white feminist writings, demonized motherhood. Well, when you're talking to Black women, particularly Black motherhood for Black women in and of itself has been a liberatory act. Okay? When you are talking about immigrant women and Black women who to this very day, in 2017, are still being put in situations where they are being forcefully sterilized or the act of choosing to be a mother in and of itself is pretty liberatory, right? And so we can have all the conversations about when people feel that they are equipped for motherhood, have all the conversations around what it means for people to be mothers in the communities that we're having babies in. But what we also need to do, right, and this is what reproductive justice does, is say that none of our choices are just independently made, divorced from the context in which we have to make these choices. So if we as Black women are seeing that we are being attacked, our reproductive health and rights are disproportionately less healthy than our white counterparts and our affluent counterparts, if we know that we are in communities, poor housing choices, and understanding that we also need to be really advocating for mothers in the reproductive rights world. Right now, other than using the term reproductive justice, reproductive rights as it exists, I don't see those conversations happening. What instead seems to be happening is a culture of quote unquote, and I'm not trying to sound like a right-wing Republican, is pro-abortion. This ability to have access to abortion. And again, I don't have anything bad to say about that. What you do with your body is your own. But in order black women's and black girls' right to abortions, we do not have to degrade, right, or exclude black access the mechanisms by which they can get healthy children. Which leads me to my next sort of, segues me into my next bit about how much I hate the term single motherhood. I hate the term single motherhood. I probably hate the term single motherhood more than I hate the term baby mama, right? And I term baby mama because when I'm speaking in AAVE, right, African American vernacular, an accepted part of that, I use it to destigmatize and deconstruct a lot of the anti-blackness that sometimes I use the term baby mama and baby daddy facetiously. But single motherhood really grates my nerves. The reality is that so many of us who are solo moms, which that term I kind of like, or unmarried mothers, or primary caregivers, whatever term you use, we're not single in the sense of that we don't have community around. I would be disingenuous and I would be doing a disservice to moms who are literally existing without very much support in their communities. That's a thing. That's why I'm doing the work that I'm doing. But many of us have intentionally built some sort of community or communities, whether it consists of family and friends, to raise our children, right? This idea, that's why I hate this myth that persists amongst women, that women, I can't be friends with women. Women are so catty. Women have no loyalty. That's bullshit. Black women would not have existed, without the networks of communities and sisterhood that we set up with each other. Now, the road that we travel down, that that idea of sisterhood might get a little mixy, might get a little messy, it might get a little scandalous. Don't mean that it don't exist, right? We are literally creating our own networks, right? We are literally all we have in many instances, right? So many of us are not single in the sense, single only refers to our marital status, and there is so much more that is involved in raising our children. So many of us have created the healthy villages that we needed in order to persist in this act of mothering and nurturing. Many of us are mothers and we don't have children. Many of us are mothering communities. I do this work and I talk about motherhood, and I'm using that broadly. I'm thinking about the many organizers and leaders that I know who do not have children, but they act as mothers every day in the work that they do. And so, we need to be really thinking broadly about that. And really, again, because I love language, I'm always thinking about the ways in which we can interrogate, and analyze our language, and the ways that it changes and when it's appropriate for it to be changed, and who's co-opting the language, right? And who's setting the metrics and standards for what's good language and bad language. And so that term single motherhood really bothers me. So for those of us who are solo mothers, and for those of us who are unmarried mothers or divorced mothers or primary caregivers or kinship mothers, which are mothers who are raising the children of relatives or friends, I would love to know about the ways in which you've built community. Do you think that I am off base here when I'm saying that I don't think that the word single mother or single motherhood is appropriate anymore? Is it an outdated term? Do we stop using that term? And what are some other terms that we could use to define those of us who are unmarried mothers? Do we even need to put that qualifier there anymore anyway, right? Like, what basis? Is it creating a false hierarchy when we put those qualifiers in front of the term mother or motherhood, right? Like, why does that even need to be there? right? Is my mothering or my mothering experience or my motherhood experience less valid because because I'm not married? Right? Because a lot of us are quote unquote single mothers and we have long term partners, right? Or we're dating and we're looking for husbands or not, right? So do we even need to be putting those qualifiers there anymore? Because when women are married, we just call them mothers. But when they're not married, they're single mothers. Can't we just all be mothers, right? So I'm interested to know to know your to know your ideas around that. And when I'm thinking about motherhood now, and I'm thinking about solo mothers, and I'm thinking about single motherhood, or what have you, I again come back to my recently deceased grandma, Alice Fields. So she just passed, and her homegoing ceremony was yesterday. Um, Married her, and it was amazing. First of all, my aunts and uncles did, and my father did an amazing job helping um to put together her homegoing service. It was beautiful and it was epic. There were so many people there. There were so many people who stood up and talked about the impact that she had on their lives. So O.A. Jeffers has said, I created a virtual community. So I love that you put that there because I forgot about that and I glossed that. That's one of the amazing things that I think about the internet. I mean, I put up a video the other day that was this gospel singer and the choir was talking about keep your business off Facebook. But for many of us, having that virtual community, being discerning about what we share, but the ability to share and the ability to be able to reach out to people with different experiences, different socioeconomic statuses, different countries, different cultural backgrounds, and be able to really, have what I like to call like a hive, that you can reach out to give you support is one of the more beautiful things about having virtual community or being able to access the internet. So I think that is great. I think that's one piece of, mothering in the technological and digital age that really benefits us, particularly those of us who may be in communities that don't have a lot of easily accessible resources right there at hand that refers to mothering. So if you don't have a community that has a lot of support groups or community organizations that are putting together support groups that has a really a disparity in terms of meeting space and community space, that doesn't have a lot of green spaces and safe spaces where people can meet, where people are not really talking to each other, where people are, more often than not, afraid of one another, or at the very least, hesitant to get involved with one another. If you are in a resilient community, but a community that's struggling, like my community in South Bronx, having the accessibility of a virtual community can be life-saving and life-changing. So, Ms. Jeffers, thank you for that piece of feedback. Back to my grandma. My grandma has 7 children. My grandma a whole community of folks who are around her, much of that being her family. And what I realized about my grandmother yesterday was that all of these people showed up and talked about how she then extended that community outwards into the community. One of the things that I did not realize, because to me she was just grandma, was that my grandmother was not just a fixture in the community in terms of people just knowing Alice because she had lived there for over 40 years, but also because she was a community activist. She had just one vice president on the Tenants Association in her building. She was extremely involved in her church, the Central Baptist Church down on 92nd Street. Even before that, people in the community had known she was involved in a lawsuit fighting gentrification in her community. I'm like, so wait a minute, all this stuff was already in my DNA. I was already genetically predisposed to this because those memories were already there. They were already being implanted. I was being nurtured in those things. The language that my grandmother used when she was helping to raise me was already there. That was already planted in me, right? My grandma didn't have to be ham-handed about it. She didn't have to be heavy-handed. It was just there. It was passed on to me. I inherited those things, and so I think about how much of my life, and I think about those discussions that she had with me when she would say to me, fuck these people. No, my grandmother said that over the age of 70. 70. My grandmother would say to me, fuck those people who have anything to say about how many children you have. I need my charger. Um, uh, about how many children you have. Shit, right? Those kids are going to always be your kids despite what they say about you. And somebody's always going to have something to say about you. And that knowledge was coming really from her experience. And I didn't always make that connection because as a younger person, you tend to have this very narrow view of um, your family members. You see them through this very narrow lens. You oftentimes forget that they may be your grandmother or your aunt or your mother or your uncle or your brother or your father, but there's something to somebody else, and that experience is very deeply. And during a homegoing service, people alluded to or talked very openly about many of the challenges that my grandmother, really had to rail against in order to raise her children as an unmarried mother of 7 children in the 60s and the 70s and the early 80s. And so I really think about her legacy and her imprint on that. I think about the fact that I became an avid baker because my grandmother very early on would take me into the kitchen with her where she would make these cakes. And there was not a whole lot of pomp, and pretension to her doing this. My grandmother just always had a cake on the table. That was the thing that she did. She always had Presto and Swan's down flour. And she would make biscuits very quickly, drop biscuits in her kitchen. And I would see that because I spent a lot of time with my grandmother early on in my life because my dad worked, and when him and my mom got separated, he became the primary caregiver for us. He was he was a single dad in that sense, but he had a lot of community that helped him as well in terms of raising the 3 and at one time the 4 of us. My mother wasn't involved. It just full-time physical custody was my dad. And we spent a lot of time with her to fill the gap in terms of child caregiving. And I remember my grandma teaching me the difference between all-purpose flour and cake flour, and when to use cake flour and when you use all-purpose flour. I remember early on in my teens, my grandma introducing me to whole wheat flour and telling me to stop using bleached flour. That it was something that they used when they were young because it was needed, but being able to tell me the context of that and saying that if I had to use all-purpose flour, to always look for unbleached flour. I remember my grandmother, and this before we ever had the term food justice, my grandmother was very particular about the quality of ingredients. She lived on the Upper West Side. She moved there before it was a gentrified community. She stayed there after it became heavily gentrified, and many people that grew up with my parents and his siblings were pushed out. And then she took full advantage of all of the amenities of that gentrified community. My grandmother didn't just go to a supermarket. My grandmother went to markets. She went to farmers markets. She went to Korean markets. My grandmother went to specialty places. She went to dairies, and she would take me with her in the summer times and when we stayed with her on weekends, and she would show me and talk to me about quality ingredients. And so very early on, I had a love for quality ingredients. I think about that imprint on my life and how it led me to doing this work that I do around food now. And so yesterday, during a homegoing ceremony, I thought it was very fitting that that my next episode of Mama Tanya's Kitchen dropped, and it was about my banana pecan cream loaf cake. And so I remixed banana bread. I made it into a loaf cake that is, a very moist, very dense, sort of soft, in the middle, kind of feels a little bit like a pudding cake. And it reminded, like when I saw it, I forgot that, it was coming out that day. And my producers had put it up and, updated the sites. And I didn't realize that, it was the day of my grandmother's funeral. And then I thought to myself, this is fitting because I love to bake. It is probably my favorite thing to do. I'm getting ready to take a cake decorating class at ICE, the Institute of Culinary Education, which many, many years ago when it was called Peter Cooking School, I attended as a steward, which I worked down inventory, and then I earned hours and I took cooking classes. That's how I feel like that because I could not afford culinary school. It was too expensive. And then they changed the name to ICE. I still know it is I still call it Peter Comes Cooking School. I'm going to go back there and take a cake decorating class because they have very affordable classes. And because I've attended, I know that they're their instructors are top notch, very experienced instructors. My grandmother taught me the tenets of presentation. My mother did not like to use, until she got older, she did not like paper plates. She did not like styrofoam plates. She thought they were wasteful. She talked about presentation. My grandmother always had, you know, big serving plates and serving spoons and china that you used. When she made a cake, that cake had to be on a cake plate. My grandmother talked to me about finding things, and she did it to me in a way that was inventive. She showed me like what it meant to go to a consignment shop, or what it meant to go to a thrift shop, and you could find places. Because she was on the Upper West Side, their thrift shops ain't like thrift shops up here in the South Bronx, I gotta tell you. So when I was going to thrift shops, I would try to go to thrift shops in places that were in close proximity to more affluent communities, because I know that those rich white folks are going to give up shit that to us look brand new. So my grandmother showed me how to find those loopholes and navigate those things. And it wasn't until, and I feel very regretful about that, it wasn't until she passed a couple weeks ago that I really started taking inventory of all of the amazing ways that her legacy imprinted me. This is the importance of mothers, right? Without Alice, there would be no Tanya. So for all of these people, right,